for attending the invite for the Monarch Candidate
Figure out what we're
Conservation
gonna
Agreement
do.
with Assurances
I was even
webinar
looking
number
at the
4.
possibility of,
I would ask that everyone go ahead and mute your microphones unless you plan on speaking. This event is going to be recorded. I'm recording it so that it can be posted on the state aid website after the event. And so hopefully if there's anyone interested in reviewing it that was not able to attend, we can point them in that direction. And with that said, I'm going to hand things off to Carol Andrews.
Super. Thanks again, Dale, for setting this up. And I'm going to get right into presentation too. Jim Foldesy is in transit, so on behalf of the Environmental Committee, welcome to the webinar on the Monarch CCAA. I understand at a board meeting of the MCEA last fall, there was a request for one more webinar, and Chris will talk pretty soon about the timing, but I did in my update at the conference also talk about that basically if anybody's going to act, it's time to think about doing that in the next few months. We want to leave most of the time today for the panel discussion at the end, but we are going to start just knowing that some people, this might be your fourth and you've gone to all these webinars, and for a few people this might be new, so I did want to touch on Monarch basics and CCAA for less than 5 minutes. Then I'm going to hand it over to Chris Smith for a few updates and answer maybe some commonly asked questions. And then, like I said, hopefully within the next 15-20 minutes, we'll get into the panel discussion. So you'll have to say something out loud if you have questions, because I can't see all this at once. Let's see. So overview, why are we talking about monarchs? The bottom line is the population of this species has declined. It got to well below 10% of what it had been in the early 90s. Around 2013, 2014, it's gotten a little bit better since then, which is good. And what that has resulted in is that the monarch is under review by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for listing under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And and it's a candidate for listing, and that's the key term that you'll keep hearing a lot. It's a candidate. Once it's listed, it's no longer a candidate. So from now, at this point, it's just a candidate for listing because of its decline. Caterpillars feed only, the monarchs feed only on milkweed when they're a caterpillar, but once they're an adult butterfly, they do use the nectar from a wide variety of flowers. So you'll sometimes hear that term floral resources, but it's important to have a variety of vegetation. They spend the winter in Mexico, and on that previous slide, that was the reason that's so, I guess, easy to count and have an idea of how many monarchs there are is because they all go to one relatively small area of 7 to 10 hectares and just coat some trees in Mexico. They typically arrive in Minnesota in early May, especially in the south, and then spread across the whole state. They lay their eggs on or near milkweed, but then they form a chrysalis, not necessarily on the milkweed. It could be anywhere in the vicinity. And then they emerge. There's several rounds per summer, but the adults that emerge in August, September migrate south. And the key point there is that monarchs exist in different forms, at life stages, and use different parts of the right-of-way and different types of vegetation. Monarch CCAA for utility and transportation lands is what we're talking about here. There's actually a document with this title. It's easier to read than you might think. And what it is a formal legal agreement. Again, it stands for Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances. And it's one of the ways in which the Endangered Species Act can allow for a permission to be given to an enrolled partner for take of a listed species once it becomes, if and when it becomes listed. I'll cover that a little bit more in a minute. But I do want to emphasize that it's only for utility and transportation land. So it's not something that anybody can sign up for. And it's, say you're a county that also has county parks. Unfortunately, it doesn't also cover park lands. It's just for transportation lands. And why would somebody sign up, a road authority sign up? We look at it as risk management here at St. Louis County. because like I said, it provides a permission for take if the Monarch gets listed in exchange for enacting conservation measures sooner than later. But by having this opportunity to take action and enroll before it's listed, you avoid having a gap during which time you might not be able to, like what happened with the northern long-eared bats, and we couldn't cut trees for a while, and that kind of goofed up a lot of projects. So it really helps reduce risk management. And in a nutshell, if a county wants to enroll, you complete an application, and once that's approved, you move on and you have a year to do an implementation plan. You follow conservation measures, and I'll have another slide on this, for 5% of your enrolled lands. And after that becomes an ongoing measure of following those conservation measures. There is an annual fee and some annual monitoring and reporting. Again, I'm sorry, this is really high level, but a few of the terms I've thrown out there, conservation measures can be a variety of things. It might include, instead of planting just the 25-141 roadside mix everywhere on a project, we just had one where we changed and we had about 2 acres where outside the mow zone, we are going to use native plant seed mix that includes flowers and milkweed that's beneficial to the Monarch. So that area would be counted as towards our, or that action would be a conservation measure. I put a star on the far right. A lot of what we're going to do is intentionally not mow the ditch and back slope in certain areas, removing trees and brush. Another option is timed mowing and how much you mow, sticking to just the inslope where possible if you don't need to do more, or say spot spraying versus broadcast. Those also qualify as conservation measures. And you do not have to do that on all your acres. For highways like MnDOT's enrolled, they have to do this on at least 8% of their enrolled lands, whereas for counties, the minimum is 5%. And we're talking about enrolled lands. This is where, like for St. Louis County, we enrolled all our road right-of-way, our gravel pits that are related to our roads, and our maintenance facility properties. Of that, at least 5% of the area is where you need to do conservation measurements, such as the woody brush removal or targeted herbicide. So it's not the whole thing. The key thing is then you have permission to do status quo O&M on all your enrolled lands by just doing conservation measures on that 1/20th of the total. So just to sort of reiterate the concept, and I think why this was included as an option in the Endangered Species Act, is that it encourages what is voluntary conservation measures to be taken in exchange for regulatory assurances. That if it's listed, that you can continue business as usual. So that was the CCAA in a nutshell. And at this point, I was going to hand it over to Chris to both cover things that I missed that are key points, but also a couple other topics.
Yeah, thanks, Carol, and feel free to jump in if I fail to mention something that you wanted me to cover. Like Carol said, I think the real important take home, and I think it's worth reiterating now, is that one of the nice aspects of these kind of what we'll call proactive conservation agreements is you do a little for a lot of regulatory protection. And so Carol articulated it well, that really you only have to change what you're doing, and maybe changes in the right word. You really just have to contribute, about 5% of your system towards Monarch conservation in this case, in exchange for being able to manage the remaining 95%, essentially unchanged. And so it's very little cost for a lot of potential reward if and when the Monarch gets listed. And then maybe I think to the next slide, is that the schedule slide, Carol? So right now, Fish and Wildlife Service has to make a kind of a final listing decision towards the end of 2024. So they have a court mandate. So this isn't something that they have a whole lot of discretion over. So we are expecting that kind of what I'll call a final listing decision, which would either then propose a listing, or it would determine that a listing is not or is no longer needed. But again, as Carol pointed out, back in December of 2020, a listing at that time was determined to be needed, but they did this whole thing where they call it warranted but precluded by other higher priorities. Essentially, there were other species more in need, kind of more time sensitive, and so they kind of pressed pause on the monarch, and that's how it became what we call a candidate species. One thing that I want to mention, and I think it doesn't take much imagination, if Fish and Wildlife decides to move forward and to list the monarch butterfly, it is very likely, and Fish and Wildlife already anticipates that they will be litigated for that decision. But at the same time, if Fish and Wildlife decides to not list the monarch butterfly, it is also very likely that they will be litigated for not listing the butterfly. And so I think even once a decision later this year is kind of said, I don't think it's the end of the story. I think we're going to have a few more years as litigation occurs where a court could interject and either list something or change the rules or delist something if Fish and Wildlife were to make kind of a procedural error in the listing process. And so again, the CCAA, from at least the MnDOT perspective, we see it as kind of an insurance policy. Again, we're kind of giving up, or we're doing some things, but it's a relatively low-hanging fruit. For us, it's about 8%, and the last few years we've really been doing about 10% of conservation activities on about 10% of our land in exchange for that kind of assurance, as we have that permit, and that permit we're expecting to protect us. Even if Fish and Wildlife decides to not list, and then it goes to court, and then a court lists it, which we've seen with the wolves out west. It's been done with a few additional species, and so that regulatory assurance piece is really, I think, something that we see a lot of value in MnDOT, and I think some of the counties that we've been working more closely with, I think, see value for kind of that protection, given the amount of uncertainty we're expecting. I'm sure I missed some stuff. Carol, anything else that you want me to touch on?
I did think of one thing. We forgot to introduce ourselves. I'm Carol Andrews. I work with St. Louis County for Jim Fuldesy. And Chris, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep. So I'm Chris Smith. I work at MnDOT in the Office of Environmental Stewardship, and I'm a wildlife biologist kind of by training. And I think important to this conversation, so MnDOT was one of the early, let's say, motivators for the development of some sort of agreement like this, recognizing that a monarch butterfly listing could have pretty far-reaching impacts on the way we both maintain our roadsides as well as deliver projects. And so we've been kind of along for the ride from start to finish on the development of this agreement, and I look forward to some additional discussion and some Q&A.
Here, a couple other things we're going to talk about. So before I leave this slide, is just that you have to keep in mind that there is a certain amount of time, probably a minimum of 6 months, but easily a year, between the time at which one applies to become a partner and when you're actually an enrolled partner covered by the agreement. And so we didn't want to risk, Jim doesn't want to risk having a gap in time between if it gets listed, goes to court, gets listed suddenly, and when we're covered. So that's why we chose to apply sooner than later. So even though this September final rule of 2025 sounds far off in the future, when you work backwards, especially if there's a large number of entities that try to enroll, a growing number, that review time could go back. The other things I was going to have you talk about, Chris, was, let's start with this one. Why is the University of Illinois Chicago involved? You had a story about that you explained the other day.
Sure, yeah. So there's a lot of kind of what I'll call mechanisms within the Endangered Species Act that in the end allow you to have a permit to take or kill an endangered species. And so when MnDOT first reached out to Fish and Wildlife regarding our concern with a potential future listing of the monarch butterfly, one of the things we said early on was like, well, we want to get ahead of this. We don't want to play the wait and see. We see the risk being too high given how abundant and kind of ubiquitous this butterfly is across Minnesota. And so we wanted to engage with Fish and Wildlife in one of these processes. And Fish and Wildlife very, very quickly said, well, you're not the only one who's concerned. There are a number of other state DOTs that were also kind of doing the same thing we were. They were reaching out, expressing concern, wanting to try to get ahead of this, knowing that everything takes a lot of time, especially when you're working across, state and federal jurisdictions. And at the same time, they were hearing from utility companies as well. And Fish and Wildlife said, look, if all of you really want to move forward with this, Fish and Wildlife, this is me kind of paraphrasing what they said. They said, well, we don't have the capacity to deal with all of you separately. And the law allows you all to kind of join forces and do something as a group. And so we looked to UIC, so the University of Illinois, Chicago. They have a program called the Rights of Way as Habitat Working Group. And it's a group that DOTs and energy companies have long been a part of, and we've had a lot of nice coordination through that group. And so we kind of look to UIC as kind of our umbrella organization, so to speak, and ask them if maybe they could help facilitate these conversations. Lots of moving parts, and they agreed early on to help facilitate some of the early conversations. And as things progressed, one of the questions that inevitably had to be asked is who's going to be the actual permit holder? So who's going to really kind of own the agreement and be responsible for the compliance of the agreement and the implementation of the agreement? And probably no surprise, everybody kind of looked around the room and said, not it. No state DOT, for example, wanted to be the one that was in charge of compliance for all state DOTs across the country. No private, energy company or no energy cooperative wanted to be in charge of everything, right? Because we're all busy people. We all have our kind of wheelhouse, and we didn't want to overextend ourselves kind of beyond what is our ordinary course of business. But UIC was in this position to kind of be this overarching organization that could maybe serve this role. And it took a bit of convincing. They were not super, and I know this is recorded now, so hopefully I don't misspeak it, but I don't recall them being super excited about being in charge of the whole thing at first. But certainly discussions were had. And in the end, the university decided that it would be something that they could take on, with some administrative fees and things to ensure they could staff up to really do all the work that would be associated with being this kind of programmatic administrator for this agreement. And in the end, it worked out, and really UIC has been great to work with for those that have worked with UIC. So that's kind of why we ended up where we are today, where, theoretically, an agency could be the permit holder, but then you're responsible for all the sub-permittees underneath that. And like I said, we kind of did this finger pointing, not it kind of deal, and instead wanted to leverage that existing kind of collaborative effort through UIC to run what we now call the kind of CCAA program.
Thanks. Super. I think that's probably good for updates. At the very end, Chris might, for those of you who have heard about some bumblebees being listed, Chris offered to also talk a little bit about efforts underway to create a bumblebee CCAA that would have some merging with this, but I don't want to get off onto that yet. But at the last 5 minutes, if we have time, or people want to stay on a few extra minutes, I think we'll cover that then. Since this was billed as a panel discussion, I thought, let's get into that. I want to hear how Rich wings it with his good joke there. And suggested questions, but you guys can talk about whatever you want, and we'll, like I said, go to Q&A. But just, I know personally, I'm curious, or think people might want to know, like, if there was how you approach preparing an application, anything you learned during the, after you submitted it, where you asked for other information, things like that. So Rich has got his camera on. Let's go over to you.
Yeah, so as I was watching webinar 1 and webinar 2, it was very good information, and I found out that it would be beneficial for Polk to jump right in. And the reason why, if I can share my screen, maybe I can, maybe I can't. Let's see here. This part of our county, where you can see all the orange lines, is our adopted acres. This part of the county already had the western fringe prairie orchid as an endangered species within it. And so we were already doing conservation methods to protect it. And so from that, it seemed reasonable that we would just sign up for the Monarch part of it. And so we have our Lake Agassiz Trail that runs from Crookston down to Fertile and actually south of Fertile. It's an ATV / snowmobile trail. And so we adopted that. It runs along Minnesota Trunk Highway 102. And then our county roads, 45, 41, 44, and then this little chunk of 49 up here. There's a parcel right at the intersection of 49 and Trunk Highway 32 and Trunk Highway 2, which is old Trunk Highway right away, about 20 acres. And we adopted that as well because it's all native prairie. And so we went through the process of how do we go best go about doing an application. And I felt it best to hire a consultant. And so I got a hold of WSB and they quoted me $17,400 to do an application and an implementation plan. And they started. We were able to, back in 2021, we were able to get our certificate in August of 22. So my 23 report was pretty small since I only had from August through December to report on. And then this year I did a full report for the Monarch. In the meantime, we had to redo our Section 7 certification for the endangered species as well. And so I went back to WSB and they were able to update that for me at a minimal cost. So as of today, Polk County is up to date with the certificate. Our implementation plan's going well. The one thing I wanted to do is be able to pick the methods that we currently were using, spot spraying, mowing, or if we were going to mow, what could we possibly do differently with our mowing operation that would be conservation listed. So there's actually a conservation mowing where you mow at a foot instead of at 4 inches or 6 inches. So mowing after September 15th, when the monarchs are supposedly leaving. And so you took that area that we had with all our roadways and talked with my maintenance superintendent, and we were able to adjust our mowing schedule slightly so that we were mowing those roads after September 15th. We're able to mow them at a foot high, and it met our compliance. And so as I went through our compliance tracking this year, I'm going to show another screen real quick. It's pretty simple. You put in the road that you're working on and what the compliance method was. So we do targeted herbicide spraying for all those roads. We also do conservation mowing for all those roads. Our Agassiz Trail, we're just doing targeted herbicide right now. And then above and beyond our adopted acres, we actually went through and regraded a roadway in 2022, finished it in 23, and we planted native prairie grass in that location. And so my original adopted acres was going to be 720, and I just revised that to 786 by planting that roadway in natives. So we are well over our 5%, and looking to continue.
One question on that, if you're over 5%, I believe you get a reduction in the annual fees. Were you able to take advantage of that?
Well, so I submitted the report for 2023 in January of 2024. So my annual fees is right around $10,000 per year to be part of it. I'm a larger county. I have a lot of acres. So I'll have to wait and see what my fee looks like in 2020, the end of 2024, early 2025. But yes, I'm assuming it's going to go down. And the more acres I adopt, or the more acres I complete of my adopted acres, the more the fee should go down as well.
Super. I'm not quite sure if we should maybe have 2 minutes for questions for Rich and then go to Mel and then have more open discussion. Otherwise, Mel, go ahead whenever.
Sure, I can tell you our story. How you doing? So when we got into this, when this first came up, we did what I would call kind of a bottom up or ground up. And so I went, when this was an option to protect what was going on with the Monarchs, I went back to the maintenance staff and said, you know, it's going to take basically our maintenance department to monitor this, and not me coming down to you telling you how to monitor it. I want you to know, like, if we're going to be mowing, I don't want it to be a problem for how we conduct business. So what I was finding out is that we have a lot of acres that are not mowed. And so I had, what I did in my case, had everybody on their plow route just drive their plow route and said, do you have acres on your route that is not mowed? As a general rule, the only mowing that happens out there is when we do our top cuts. And so they came back and said, we have all kinds of acres that all we do is that aren't hayed. So I said, so that was the first marker. Then the second one was like, is there the necessary milkweed and flowering plant in those areas? And they said it is, because the northern part of our county is very prone to having that kind of plant material. So I went to the county board because it is, you know, for us, it does avoid delay in construction and maintenance. It is a proactive approach to maintaining the monarch, the habitat of not only the monarch, but any species that utilizes those plants. And since our number one driver of industry in our county is ag, but our number two driver of industry is tourism. And so it does kind of play into both of those, because we have the ability to do it. Plus it gives the angle of the people in the Lakes region for sure kind of latched on. So I went to the county board, and then what the county board did is they wanted me to reach out to all the impacted. So to back up just one step, we don't have near the miles that Rich does. We've only got 3,940 acres of enrolled, which includes our county roads. And so our adopted acres is only 197 acres. So our adopted acres is not a lot. And it does two things. It's not a lot, so you can easily monitor it. And number two, it doesn't cost as much. So the risk for us was not maybe as high. And our county board told me to reach out to the neighbors that would be where we would have these adopted acres. And I don't think I got one negative comment back from any of these people. In fact, some of them called me and said, you know, these are large farmers in some cases. And they said they just want to know if they can move it from here to here, or just put it, you know, where they wanted it on their land. And I'm saying, you know, within our right of way. And they were surprisingly easy. It surprisingly was kind of an easy process for me. And so we don't alter our mowing. We do the top cut, and then from there out to the right of way line is our adopted acres. So for us, we've been actually enrolled since April of 2021. And so we've been in this for what, 3 years now. But it's been a positive thing. It's been a positive thing for us pretty much in all aspects. There is, I think when I look at the cost, for us, it's about $3,000 a year, which might seem like a lot to some smaller rural counties, but for us, the cost of construction or maintenance delay, the benefit would outnumber the cost in our case. So if it's listed. So did I touch on everything that you wanted me to touch on? I'd be open for questions, but it's been a positive response for us.
Do you want to talk a little bit about monitoring? I'd be curious, do you do your own monitoring? Is it Angela works with you, or do you guys do your own reporting?
On that note, so we just did it all internally. We had 2 maintenance staff that were willing to take it on as a project for them. And then we had we hired, when the buffer law came into being, we had a full-time employee hired to do the buffer law. And then we come into compliance on that. So then we basically, she had her own side business anyway. And so Angelica was her name. So she terminated work with the county in terms of a full-time employee and became an employee on a contract basis to administer this program. And so we did probably to some degree hire a consultant, or we did it all internally originally. And then the continuous annual reports now are done by, we have a $10,000 retainer for her to do whatever we need to do on this program. And I don't think we've ever spent that this year. We probably spend 40 hours a year on this.
I see, Rich, you answered that question too. I don't know if you want to talk to monitoring since we're on that, if it's been easy and who does it for you guys?
Yeah, so basically, as part of the implementation plan, we picked 10 spots randomly along our trail because we knew it would be easy to monitor the 21 miles of trail first. And based on that, then I had my survey crew go out and put a stake in the ground where the site was along the trail. And then had my noxious weed inspector / sprayer go out there during the month of, I think it was the month of late June, early July. And there's a form that UIC, as part of the toolkit, puts on their website. We picked what method we wanted to use. I think it was method number 2, and use their form, and you basically count the number of flowering plants, the number of milkweed, how many monarchs or butterflies you see flying in that 10 by 10 square area, and you just monitor each of those sites or inspect each of those sites during that. And then we actually went back the end of August and did it again. So we actually did it twice this year. And pretty simple, it, wasn't real time consuming, and they haven't negatively written back to me saying we did it wrong or that we should have done more. So we must have did okay.
The only, Carol, the only thing that, and then Rich, I don't know if they've been pushing you for geospatial surveying of your areas. Have you done that?
I have not, but not to say we couldn't.
So we are going to be doing that, and what the reason that we're doing that for UIC is, so if there's a utility that's also got it as adopted acres or enrolled acres, if there's any duplication. And so we are in the process of doing that this spring.
And I mean, I've been contacted by 3 different utilities that said, oh, you're listed in Minnesota. Where are you at? Sent them my acres. They always email me back saying, oh, we're not near that. We're good. So yeah, it wouldn't be very difficult for me to go out there and survey in our adopted acres. It'd be pretty simple, actually.
Chris, did you want to add anything about monitoring? I know there's a video on the, maybe that's part of the toolkit that you put a link to, but I remember a long time ago watching a video and I thought, okay, I could do that. It sounds like a fun excuse to get out of the office, actually.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the MnDOT side of things, we're at a pretty large scale, so we do a lot more monitoring than I think those counties that are participating are doing currently. We do all of our monitoring in-house currently, mostly with our Office of Environmental Stewardship staff, but we do have a few maintenance folks in some of the far away, hard to reach places that have stepped up to help facilitate that. I think for us, the biggest time commitment is actually the drive time to get to all of our sites because they're spread out statewide. But the nice thing about the CCAA, and I think hopefully you'll hear this a few times during the Q&A here, is that really the goal was to be as flexible as possible. So there's kind of a few different options for how you do your monitoring. You don't need to be a professional botanist. At the bare minimum, you just need to really be able to tell, is it a milkweed species, or is it really that's actually all you would need to know. And then there are options to collect a little bit more of the information, like we heard about flowering plants. Do you see monarchs? Do you see other insects? But there's really a few different options meant to be kind of tailored to the skills and the sites in question to kind of make it as approachable as possible for those that want to participate. We didn't want a lack of, plant experience to be a barrier to participate. So.
Thanks. And Mel, did we cut you off or should we go on? I was going to have Sean West, if he wants, from Stearns to talk about where they're at, and I can talk a little bit about where we are. But
No,
otherwise,
I'm good. I'm available for questions. So.
Okay.
Yep.
I see Joe's added a question. I think the answer is yes, Joe. I'm going to go look for that. Unless Dale, if you can look on the state aid website. Joe Triplett asked, has a basic one-pager type doc been developed for county board in county board speak? And I remember, I think there's some on the state aid website, Dale, if you can look. Otherwise, I know there's some PowerPoints on that. And that might be a good segue because I think in Stearns, you guys have talked to your board about it. So is Terry or Sean or somebody from Stearns County want to talk? And then I'll might show our calculations for our enrolled area and so on.
Real quick, Carol. Yes, there is. There's a request for board action PDF with talking points on the state aid website.
Like my first boss said, always plagiarize, never write anything original. Good question, Joe. Stearns County.
Well, I was hoping Sean was going to jump in here because I think everybody on here knows that Sean is doing all the work related to this. But we are talking about going back to our board just to refresh their memory. We do have a new commissioner. So we have the draft that he had done a while ago that just, I think, slightly needs to be updated. And then we need to look at our mileage that we initially picked. But I think we're basically planning to move forward.
Yeah, and I did want to talk a little bit on the geospatial part of it, and maybe Mel can answer some questions about this, but do you actually plan on doing boots on the ground surveying, or are you looking at desktop application for this as far as like AutoCAD or GIS?
For our geospatial stuff?
Yep.
We were going to survey it.
Okay.
On the ground.
Okay. Because I think during our initial design, when we were choosing our roads to adopt, we did basically a desktop exercise in AutoCAD to come up with our areas. And so we kind of excluded areas that were like view sheds for homes or within municipalities, that sort of thing.
That's what we did when we did our application. That is correct. But now that they want the geospatial more accurate, I think, so they can put it on probably ArcGIS. They can list all their acres. We were just going to do some field work. I mean, and honestly, if we had a normal winter, we probably wouldn't offer that. But that's what we're thinking this year because it's open.
Okay.
I'd just like to, since we have so many people, ideally go ahead and use the chat and keep the questions going. That's the main point here, is not my questions, but yours. But so keep posing those. Also, if there's any other counties that have applied to become a CCAA partner that we just don't know of, speak up or let us know in the chat. Dale?
I'm gonna jump in here, Carol,
Yeah.
and I'm just gonna put a plug for the state aid website. There is at the top of the project delivery environmental page, there is a whole section devoted towards this conversation, the Monarch Butterfly. Links all throughout. As stated earlier, here's the request for board action letter with talking points. There's common FAQs. There's PowerPoint presentations if you want to see how some other successful presentations were done to their boards. The very first link is also the Rights of Way Habitat Working Group, which Chris can talk a little bit more about if he hasn't, but there is a lot of information here, additional talking points if you're looking for those, more what if questions, why, all sorts of resources we're trying to get at your disposal at a quick and convenient location. So that's, again, all hosted on the SALT website. It's under the project delivery, and I can send out an e-scenes that talks about this and puts that plug out there as well.
Okay, I'm seeing now in the chat. Thanks, Dale. And I'm trying to remember, Dale, one last thing on that. There is some example, does that include example applications? And let's just say it this way, if it doesn't, I'll make sure, I can't remember if I sent you ours to upload, but I think it had MnDOT's to start with. So if people who have applied, so now I see Beltrami and Douglas County have, is this safe to say, Dale, they can send their application to you and you can upload it?
Yeah, if there's other examples, I can upload those to the state aid website. There is one example on here right now. I believe it's Stearns County has theirs up there as an example.
Okay. And it's just, it's a Word document. I'm sharing my screen here, you can see, and I started with MnDOTs and changed things. It's just, it's questions. We did ours in-house. I mean, I did and Jim reviewed it, but, you know, describing what you have, I think some of the questions are interesting and makes you think, including, you know, what are some of the constraints that affect your ability to implement conservation measures? We live in a forested region, so actually the biggest problem we have, not only for having growing milkweed, but is just keeping safe roadsides, it's cutting trees. And it's kind of crazy, but basically it's like, oh, now if people get mad at us for cutting trees, we can say, but it's for the butterflies and in case your car goes off the road. But so I'm not going to go through all this, but it's not super long. There's some attachments you need to provide, but don't be intimidated by the length of it, because there's several pages you get into here, which you should read because you're going to at some point sign it. But it's just, what would you call it? Template. You know what I mean? So the blue part is what I answered, but all this other in black, you know, is the template. So it's not like you're being asked to write a whole paper on the Monarch and how you feel about it. It's fill in the blank and check the boxes, things like that. And then, yeah, I think all the rest of these pages from this point on are just the template wording from the document. Did I get that right, Chris?
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, like you said, don't be scared away by its actual length, because really just fill in these small parts. There was a question in the chat that I wanted to get to before we lose track of it. So Jason had asked about, you know, if folks are enrolling some of their more urban areas, and what is the risk to a county, or in my case, MnDOT, if an adjacent property owner, you know, mows the roadside or the ditch. And it's a great question. I think it is one of the strengths of this agreement. So kind of going back to that early conversation, if you have your adopted acres, you know, as a county, you're doing, you know, some conservation measures on about 5%, then the remaining 95% can kind of be managed as status quo. And so if an adjacent landowner goes on and mows up monarch habitat, for example, and it's not the adopted acres, then by having the county enroll in this agreement, you're essentially shielding those individuals from potential liability with respect to the ESA and the Monarch Butterfly. And so we've kind of viewed this as like another benefit to kind of our customers. I mean, we have a lot of interest in haying MnDOT roadsides, for example, especially in western Minnesota. And if MnDOT, for example, didn't participate in this agreement, and if the Monarch got listed in a way that would say that haying is illegal, we wouldn't legally be able to allow them to do that. We couldn't issue them permits for haying without us running afoul of the law and them, exposing them to liability. But by our participation in this agreement, we're able to shield those other uses of our right-of-way from some of that liability. Now, to maybe answer this question a little bit more pointedly, so Fish and Wildlife has asked me, well, what are you going to do, if, someone's out haying a roadside and the Monarch's listed and you're not part of this agreement? Like, what do you envision, like, the issue, how would you handle that as an agency if that were to be a situation? And again, so you as a county or us as MnDOT, we would not be liable for somebody else's action as long as we weren't permitting it. So as soon as we permit something, and if we weren't part of this agreement, then we would be liable for allowing it to happen. So you would be at greater risk. But if you're in the CCAA, or even if you're not in the CCAA and a third party goes out and hays, as long as you didn't tell them it was okay to do, the ESA doesn't have this. Fish and Wildlife can enforce the ESA for someone else's behavior on your land, as long as you didn't grant them permission. I think hopefully I kind of, maybe not in a very good way, answered that question. But the nice thing about the CCAA is that, again, you shield both yourself and other potential users of your right-of-way from some of that liability. And so I think it's another kind of win-win situation.
Does that mean you need to put signs up in your adopted areas if you think there's some chance of somebody else going in to hay, mow, or otherwise disturb it?
It's a good question. So some states have put signs in their adopted acres. MnDOT isn't, at least we haven't so far. Again, as far as like your adopted acres go, I think ideally you wouldn't have kind of the trespass issues and haying and other activities occurring in those areas. And I've heard it from several folks that you kind of tried to select areas that you thought were going to be kind of low controversy or low conflict. In MnDOT, we've done the same thing. We've tried to identify roads where we don't currently have much mowing and haying pressure, so that we can, not create conflict unnecessarily. But as far as, again, kind of going back to what I was trying to articulate not very well, as long as somebody hays your adopted acres without your permission, you're kind of not on the hook. You're not going to be liable. I think Fish and Wildlife might ask you to try to stop it from happening. Do you know who it is? Can you send them a letter, like a cease and desist kind of thing? But you're not going to be the one that gets any sort of enforcement action. If anything, Fish and Wildlife might take an enforcement action against the person actually doing the haying, in kind of the most extreme scenario. But there is this kind of monitoring and kind of compliance tracking that is reported. And if I presumably, and we haven't had to do this too much, but presumably if you kept reporting that like my adopted acres were getting hayed by somebody, Fish and Wildlife and UIC might say, well, can you either pick a different set of adopted acres where maybe that conflict doesn't exist, or can you work with the community through public outreach to try to, try to avoid some of that conflict. If that makes sense. I don't know, Carol, you're giving me a look like maybe it doesn't.
No,
make
I'm
sense,
looking
but...
at, I'm trying to decide if I should show real quick. So just for our update for St. Louis County, I did this application actually like in 2021, but then we did just sort of sit on it for a variety of reasons. But I was just going to share how we came up with our enrolled acres. We did, so I saw, like Rich said, you just did rural roads. We did everything. So that includes, our CASAs that go right through Duluth and Hibbing and so on. But to come up with the area, we divided we just used 66 feet wide with 24-foot pavement that we did not include. We did not include the pavement in our enrolled areas acreage. So we did 66 feet wide for county roads and township roads and 75 feet wide for CSAs. Is that exact? No, but it was, and we'll see, we haven't gotten comments back yet. And we submitted in October from the UIC, but we felt, and we did discuss this actually with them on the phone, and they said that was a reasonable way to estimate it. And then we also added gravel pits. There's a whole pages and pages of gravel pits, and that adds for us another 1,000 acres, just because we have so many miles of gravel roads, and then 170 acres of public works facilities. So we're at a total acres enrolled of 17,000, which puts us at 800 some adopted acres. But if this isn't on the shared, if people would find this of use, I could clean it up and send it to Dale. But my feeling is whatever makes sense to you as far as coming up with your area. Who else wants to share what they did? Anything from Beltrami or Douglas County? Did you take any approaches differently?
I guess the one other thing for us in Douglas County, so we have several county parks. And no, they wouldn't let us use the county park because it isn't transportation based. But if we had a county park that was adjacent to one of our right of ways, we were able to include that acreage. And a lot of that we have planted in natural habitat anyway. So there's a lot of that area that we just had to adopt it. And since we have native plant there, they were good. So that was something else that I found very interesting. So again, if it's just parkland that isn't adjacent to any transportation type corridors, we couldn't take it. But like we have a trailhead for the Central Lakes Trail, they allowed us to use that. So that was actually pretty big for us. Made it pretty easy for us to jump in on this.
That is really interesting because that was, I know in 2020, 21, that was the biggest question we got was why can't we use our park areas? So I hadn't heard that if it's adjacent to the county road, maybe you can. That could be a really big game changer for some people. Thanks, Tim. And Dale, I did see your question. And other people let me know if I'm missing things in the chat. But you had asked about the overlap with the Bs. Should we jump ahead to the B CCAA maybe?
Yeah, and so this is a very similar but also slightly different effort. So Fish and Wildlife is in the process of a bunch of rulemaking, and so going forward, the Bumblebee Agreement is going to be called a CBA. So we're going to add another acronym for you, and that's the Conservation Benefits Agreement. And so like CCAAs are kind of going away in general, and they're just going to get lumped in a bigger bucket, so to speak. And without really bogging us down, because I see there's a couple more questions coming in. There are, so the more or less the same group is working on the Bumblebee Agreement. It is meant to be as complementary as possible to the Monarch Agreement, so that in many cases you can do a lot of the same stuff and kind of get double credit. So just know that if you're in a county that has either rusty patch bumblebees or there are several other species, so I just put the link in the chat. You scroll down, you can see a map, and you can click on that map, and the link is fixed so that folks, I think, should be able to click it. It kind of gives you a sense for where some of these other bumblebees are, and they're all in the process, or most of these bumblebees are in the process of being assessed for federal listing. So again, we're trying to get ahead of some of those, what I'll call issues, because we did not get ahead of the rusty patch, and the rusty patch is causing us quite a bit of heartburn in MnDOT and some of our, especially metro counties where we have a lot of these bumblebees. So we're trying to get ahead of it before any additional species gets listed. But back to the question in the chat. So are townships or cities eligible or exempt? So any unit of government that, or I shouldn't even say unit of government, any body that is managing transportation or utility lands is eligible. So we do have a few like tollway. I mean, Minnesota's not a big tollway state, but we have some like privately held tollways, for example, that are enrolled. And then a lot of the energy companies are private, but certainly townships and cities are eligible. I think as your right of ways get narrower and narrower and more managed, like more highly kind of managed, probably the risk analysis changes a little bit, but it's going to, I think, vary between city to city because not all cities are equal, right? So let's see here. So if a county has a bridge project. So if say a county were to have a project that's on a township road, would it be covered? Probably not, without knowing all the details. But essentially, the Monarch CCAA, there's kind of two categories of land. So there's what you enroll, and that's like what your permit is going to cover. And so, and I don't know enough about how township roads work, so I'm maybe in dangerous territory here, but unless the county owns or manages the township road and enrolls it in their original application, that township road wouldn't be covered by the permit. So only the enrolled lands are covered. And then the adopted lands are the subset of the enrolled lands where you're doing your 5% conservation measures, if that makes sense. So you think of the enrolled lands as your permit covered lands, and your adopted lands as the subset where you're doing your conservation activities. So I don't know if that answered your question, Joe. So yeah, if the county maintains those roads, then yeah, you can enroll them, and then it would be covered in that case. The nice thing too is you know early on there was some confusion. You don't have to quote unquote own the road, right? So a lot of our roads and a lot of your roads are there by like prescriptive easement. You just need to have some legal authority to maintain and manage the roads themselves. And so so as long as you have some authority over the vegetation management of the roadside, it's something that you can cover by the permit. You don't have to be the underlying fee, title owner of the land. And so for a lot of utility companies, they don't own their utility corridors at all. They have a easement to be there, but if that easement grants them the authority to manage vegetation, then they're eligible to use those lands.
One other tool that you can get from the UIC website is the partner fee calculation. So this is a spreadsheet template that you can download and fill out and walk through. And it's where you can choose if you go from 5% to 7% adopted acres, for example, incorporate pollinator habitat, integrated vegetation management objectives. You get up to, like, I randomly picked 3 of those and we got a 7% deduction. So anyway, those of you who are curious, and it has a lot of information on the different tabs as well that explains how the different fees are set. So I know fee was, I don't want to end on fees because that's sort of a negative connotation, but I did want to point out that's out there for people who are saying, well, I need to know how much this costs before I go to my board to figure that out. It is 4 o'clock. I think at least Chris and I can stay on longer. Whoever else, if people need to drop off. Thanks much. I think we had 80 some people here, so hopefully that's a good sign and this was of use. But yeah, if people want to stay on, raise your hand, speak up. Otherwise, yeah, can wrap up. Somebody say in the chat if this was useful or not. You can say you're fired. All right, thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Jody.
Yep. And I just want to take a moment to thank Carol and Jim at St. Louis County and Dale at State Aid for really helping keep this message, moving forward and being a good resource. So just want to thank you all for your work on the local road side of things.
Thank you, Chris. We rely on you for a lot. So I do not know seriously what we do without you at MnDOT. So tell your boss to keep making your non-spare time available for this.
So Chris, you said your maps are coming out probably later this year as to where you've adopted. So
Yep.
It'd be interesting to know which acres you adopted in Polk, if it's in the same area. I'm hoping it is.
It is. I know, Rich, you had reached out a while back, I think, and suggested that it would be nice to try to keep some of those adopted acres near each other. So I think we did. We have that same Highway 2 and a couple other segments up there. I do have a shapefile, so if you're a GIS person and you email me, I can send you a copy of our adopted acres. It's just not online, like in a publicly available way quite yet, and it's just the center lines. But we actually have polygons now of our roadside adopted acres that we had a couple of GIS student workers working on this winter. And our hope is to roll that out publicly, like public facing, towards the end of this year. We have to go through a bunch of hoops to get anything public facing, but we're heading down that path. So.
Sounds good. The other thing is hopefully between us and you, we can work together. And if our adopted acres are near yours and you're going to do a controlled burn or we require one, it would be nice to work together since you've done it in the past. I know you've controlled burned on Trunk Highway 102, so right next to our trail. But I'm trying to couldn't get U.S. Fish and Wildlife to jump on board, but they were thinking more of the Nature Conservancy or somebody else could help out with doing controlled burns if we ask. So.
Yeah, let's talk. We have a burn boss, kind of our statewide burn coordinator person, and he, I know, has all sorts of places planned, and I'm not in the loop as far as where he's planning on burning next. But yeah, let's make some connections and yeah, see if we can't complement each other's work.
Sounds good. Thank you.
That's a good point. Is I've been trying to, at first I thought, oh, we'll do some partnering with various environmental groups or, Wild Ones and Monarch buddies and stuff. And we have been approached to say, oh, we have some milkweed, can we plant it? But that doesn't really add up in from a volume of adopted or enrolled adopted acres. I mean, so we've realized our main focus needs to be on what our maintenance staff can do or not do. Gina has a hand up.
Hi, instead of typing, I just thought it'd be easier to talk. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thanks for doing this. It's really helpful. I'm wondering if you are aware of the Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program and how that differs or compares to the CCAA. We applied for a National Fish and Wildlife Federation grant, and implementing the Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program is a portion of the grant. So I just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, if there's time.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to it a little bit. You might know more than I do, Gina. So my understanding is that Monarch monitoring, whatever the acronym is, the long title there, is really about kind of monitoring monarch caterpillar numbers, like long term, from like a population and research standpoint. I don't believe that effort has the same kind of like regulatory, like permitting aspects to it. But if I'm mistaken, let me know. The CCAA is primarily a regulatory document, and the monitoring is fairly minimal, to be honest. So it's not nearly as rigorous as some of the other monitoring programs out there that are being used for monarchs and other rare insects. But again, it was the kind of balance to how do we have a regulatory program that we felt confident was going to have this conservation benefit to the monarch butterfly without making it so complicated and, you know, requiring so much technical expertise that there's a huge barrier to participation. And so, you know, we worked closely with, you know, UIC, Fish and Wildlife, and then all the stakeholders to really try to find that balance. You know, we want, so we want to have a lot of participation, do a lot of good, and, you know, spreading out the work so that no one group is responsible, you know, for saving the monarch, for example. It's the all hands on deck approach that is often used in the monarch context. So yeah, maybe a little bit long-winded there, Gina, but I think they're different in that the one you mentioned, I think, is more like research population focused, and the other one's a little bit more regulatory focused. But if I am mistaken or misunderstanding, either let me know now or shoot me an email with some more information, because I'd like to learn a little bit more about it.
Nope, that was helpful. You answered it. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, and Carol, I like that that comment there. So really the consortium approach to the CCAA was meant to, you know, spread the burden out across a much larger group. You know, so when states or other entities have gone after similar permits on their own, it is a huge time lift, and it's often a very costly endeavor. And so some of the counties here might be familiar with the Lake States BAT HCP that Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan DNR worked on. That was like 7 or 8 years of work, and I think last I heard, I think it was like a $3 to $4 million effort. And so these things take a lot of time and a lot of money, especially when they're not, you know, kind of prioritized and fast tracked. The CCAA, I forget exactly what our overall budget was, but it was pretty spendy to pull this together. It was over $1 million. And mostly that was kind of crowd funded, if you will, between the state DOTs and the energy companies, with a little bit of grant money built in. And by no means is the CCAA the only route to compliance if and when the monarch gets listed. But if you were to wait till a listing takes place and want to go, you know, go after a permit, you know, kind of on your own, it likely would be much more costly to do that. So we view this as a relatively low cost regulatory solution, again, kind of spreading the burden out so that no one agency or entity had to really shoulder that full cost of pulling this sort of thing together. And it's the same strategy we're taking with the Bumblebee agreement, again, trying to spread that out so that no one entity is on the hook for all the costs. Well, I apologize, Carol. I do need to jump to another meeting, but I'm happy if folks have follow-up questions. You can either send them to Carol and she and I can put our heads together and respond, or you can send them to me, however folks want to do it. But certainly are a resource here. And I, again, appreciate everybody's time and interest in this topic. And, you know, lots of moving pieces in the next few years with endangered species, lots of potential listings, and look forward to problem solving. You know, it keeps our lives interesting, right? So.
Yeah. Super. All right. Well, let's wrap it up there unless anybody else closing remarks. Dale, call it a day.
Yep, let's call it a day, and we'll get this post on the state aid website.
All right. Thanks a lot for setting this up.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thanks, Mel and Rich and everybody else.